Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Officers of the university, members of the faculty, Dr. Banerjee, members of the foundation, ladies and gentlemen. I want to think with you for a while about the problems raised by slave medicine, medical care provided to enslaved African Americans by white physicians, and the general problem of the banality of evil. After Professor Schmidt's kind introduction, I should have the decency to go ahead and die, since the obituary seems quite fine. I recently read Nicholas Katzenbach's memoirs. Professor Schmidt mentioned Nicholas Katzenbach. If you don't know the name, you know the image. A man of about 6 feet tall, slightly stooped over, mopping his bald head with a large handkerchief while George Wallace makes a speech in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. He was the Assistant Attorney General for Bobby Kennedy, who was assigned to desegregate the University of Alabama and the University of Mississippi. And when his memoirs came out last year, I, of course, read them, and then looked in the back, and there was a picture of an elderly bald man, Nicholas Katzenbach, former Attorney General, former Assistant Secretary of State, former Chief Counsel for IBM, retired and lives in Princeton, New Jersey. Wonders of the Internet, I typed in 411.com, Nicholas Katzenbach, Princeton, New Jersey, and I found an address. And they wrote a letter, "Sir, you have no idea who I am. When I was a little boy, you were my hero, and maybe you knew my uncle, the Senior Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. I have an autograph here in my collection of James Meredith, the African-American who was admitted to the university. Would you co-autograph it for me and sign your book?" And a week later, I got a letter back on what some of you will understand what I'm about to say, on crane rag stationery. This is a form of communication of a certain generation long gone, with thermally embossed names, Nicholas DeVere Katzenbach. Dear Dr. Halperin, of course I knew your uncle, a fine jurist. You go right ahead and mail your material to me. I will sign it and send it back. So, well, what Professor Schmidt didn't tell you about in his kind introduction was that I am a stamp collector. Stamp collectors are the most innocent and benign of human beings. They don't bother anybody. Stamp collectors just sit around and look at little colored pieces of paper, holding them in tongs and looking at them under magnifying glasses and wondering how many perforations they have. Stamp collectors are much nicer than coin collectors, who are always worried about how much it's worth. Stamp collectors don't care how much it's worth. They just worry about leaving things for their widows to have to dispose of when they're gone. What am I supposed to do with that stuff? Because I'm a stamp collector, I'm always buying things for my collection. And once you buy things for your collection, you end up being on mailing lists of people who want to sell you things, such as stamp and letter dealers. 5 years ago, in a catalog for auction, I noticed that there was a letter for sale from 1841. The auctioneer wasn't sure what it was. He thought it was a doctor's bill, and he posted it for auction opening bids at $75. I bid $40 for it and got it. Here it is. It's on the slide, and I'm holding it up for you. It's about 7.5 by 9 inches. It's an old piece of paper. On the side, which is projected on the screen, which I'm holding up now, you can see that it's folded 12 places, and that there's a stain in the upper corner that's red. That was the wax that must have been used to seal it. Americans thought that envelopes were a frivolity. Why waste good paper, which is very expensive, on an envelope? You mailed a letter by folding it. Indeed, the Postal Service didn't charge by the weight. They charged by the number of sheets of paper. So it was much less expensive to write everything on one sheet of paper and fold it than use multiple sheets. If you're of a certain generation, you'll remember things that were called aerograms, which was a similar idea for overseas mailing. On this side of the piece of paper, it says, and I'll be reading over here, Mr. John S. Mosby, Brighton, courtesy of Henry Metcalf, Esquire. And then on the other side it says, Bill, Dr. V. Metcalf, 1841, Fitzhenry Babbitt, $15. On the other side of the piece of paper, in beautiful handwriting, it says in the upper corner, Montrose, December 22nd, 1841. Dear Sir, below you will find your medical bill for the present year, made out as you requested through Henry. Very respectfully, yours, V. Metcalf. Mr. John S. Mosby, to Metcalf, Doctor. For professional services to women belonging to Mr. R. Phipps, $15. The abbreviation D0 means ditto. For professional services to Fitzhenry Babbitt, $15. For professional services to Mrs. Mosby, children and servants, $47. Total, $77. December 22nd, 1841. Receive payment, V. Metcalf. This little piece of paper is called by stamp collectors a cover or a stampless cover. And you would rightly say, well, how do you know it's a letter? There is no postage stamp. Postage stamps were invented in 1837. This letter is from 1841. They were invented by Sir Rowland Hill. The first postage stamp was introduced in the United Kingdom in 1840. It's called the penny black. It has a picture of Queen Victoria. It says nothing about what country it's from. It's Queen Victoria. You, of course, know where it's from. And that's why still in 2012, British stamps are the only country in the world that don't identify the country. It's a British stamp because there's a small symbol of the Queen in the corner, and you ought to know that. In the United States, postage stamps were introduced in 1847 with pictures of Benjamin Franklin, the first Postmaster General, and George Washington. So this letter was sent before there were postage stamps. So how were letters sent before postage stamps? There were two ways. You would go to the postmaster and pay the postmaster a few pennies to send it, in which case the postmaster would write the amount that you paid in the upper corner. But more commonly, there would be a broadside at a post office about the letters that had been received, and you had to pay to pick them up. So if you didn't want to pay the doctor, you just never picked up your mail. But there are no markings on this piece of paper indicating transmission through the U.S. mail, so it's very likely that it was hand-carried, most likely by this person, Henry, who is identified, from Montrose to Brighton. Thus, it's a stampless cover. Now, my little piece of paper raises several historical questions. It's a bill. It was sent from Montrose to Brighton. What are Montrose and Brighton? Where are they? Are they towns, businesses, places? What and where are they? It was sent from Dr. Volney Metcalf to Mr. John Mosby. Who are these people? The bill mentions several other people. Henry Metcalf, Fitzhenry Babbitt, and Mr. R. Phipps. Who were they? And most tantalizingly, what does it mean to have a medical bill which refers to people as women belonging to and servants? I have spent 5 years studying this piece of paper, on and off, and last year I decided I finally had figured it out, that I knew who almost all these people were, where they were, and what the interesting questions were that were posed by my little piece of paper. There are lots of places in the United States called Montrose, it turns out, and I looked at lots of them and wrote off letters to various museums and people, the Metcalfs of this or that family, trying to figure out where Montrose was. I learned that the teddy bear is named after Theodore Roosevelt, who wouldn't shoot a bear that was tied to a tree because it wasn't sporting. He was hunting with the Metcalfs of Mississippi, but it wasn't these Metcalfs. But after a while, staring at maps of places where there might be women belonging to, I focused on the state of Mississippi, the western border defined by the Mississippi River, To the south and west, the state of Louisiana, part of the state bordering on the Gulf of Mexico. Mississippi, like Kentucky and North Carolina, has an unusual number of counties, and as you keep looking at them and blow it up with your magnifying glass, I began to focus on Adams County, Mississippi, in the lower southwest corner. And in Adams County, Mississippi, the largest town is Natchez, and there is a circuitous western border defined by the Mississippi River and the tributaries of the river. And eventually I located a map of the plantations of Adams County, Mississippi in the Mississippi State Archives, and found that on the tributaries of the river there are two plantations about 8 to 10 miles apart, one called Brighton, the other called Montrose. And that the Montrose plantation was owned by a man named Metcalf, and the Brighton plantation by a man named Mosby. So I focused my investigation there. The slave population of the United States was 1.5 million in 1820. The U.S. Constitution allowed the Congress to forbid importation of slaves after 1808, and the Congress did. But the slave population grew more than twofold from 1820 until the onset of the Civil War in 1860, numbering 4 million souls. The U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1788, considered slaves 3/5 of a person for the purpose of proportioning members of the House of Representatives and for the apportionment of taxes. The Congress was not prohibited to prohibit the importation of slaves prior to 1808. Benjamin Franklin promptly tried to violate the Constitution with a group of Quaker friends, and in the first session of the U.S. Congress introduced a bill to abolish slavery. It almost broke the Congress in its first session, but Congress put it off. But when 1808 rolled around, 20 years after the ratification, importation was halted, but not interstate trade in humans. To Southerners, the noble African American, well equipped with tools, marching off to the field, was the archetype, while the slave owner sat on the front porch with the wife and happy child nearby as he studied the daily news. But we know the truth of slavery. This is a document from a French Caribbean colony which has a very careful listing of what is a quadroon and an octoroon, the various permutations of mixed race and the social standing about whether or not you were viewed as 1/4 African American or 1/8 or 1/16, or whether an African American had borne children with a Hispanic. Human beings were marched from place to place without regard to family connections. In this image, you see the slave owners with whips on horseback marching chained individuals with no shoes on from one work site to another. You not only would have the slaves work on your plantation, you could subcontract them. The railroads of the American South were often built by slaves who were rented to the railroad company by the slave owner. And of course, you would buy life insurance on them from the New York Life Insurance Company. In case they died, you, as the owner of the property, would be reimbursed. Not too long ago, the New York Life Insurance Company, still in business, set up a program for scholarships in Mississippi to pay back for the amount of money they made by insuring slaves in Mississippi. These slaves were often poorly fed and poorly clothed. Here you see images of slaves working with only a loincloth, no shirt, no shoes, grinding up food. This image from Harper's Weekly, an illustrated northern newspaper, is a very famous image. Focus your attention on the lower image, the large one in the middle. What the artist is showing are the keloid forms on the back of the slave from whipping. Lincoln said, "If I need to preserve slavery to save the Union, I will. If I need to destroy slavery to save the Union, I will." In the beginning, he thought he ought to preserve slavery. He wanted to prevent its extension into the Kansas and Nebraska territories, but he said he would leave it alone in states where it was currently legal. By 1862, he was persuaded otherwise by Secretary of State Seward of New York, Salmon Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury from Ohio, also from Ohio, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. And on New Year's Day, 1863, Lincoln issued an Emancipation Proclamation declaring that within the states that were in active rebellion against the Union, all persons held as slaves are henceforth free. You notice the wording? He freed the slaves in states under rebellion. He did not free the slaves in Kentucky. Kentucky was a part of the Union. Did not free the slaves in Maryland or Delaware. They were slave states, but they had not seceded. The slaves were viewed initially as contraband of war. Slaves were not fully freed until almost 3 years later when, under the Andrew Johnson administration, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, which declared slavery unconstitutional. John Mosby was a slave owner. He was born, I know, in 1801. I don't know when he died. I do know that there are marriage records showing that in 1837 he married a widow named Frances Babbitt. He had an 180-acre plantation called Brighton, and he had 20 slaves. We know a fair bit about Mr. Mosby because he was often in financial trouble and would put his slaves up for collateral for loans. In order to keep the plantation afloat, he ran a private school on the property. And in 1861, the slaves on the Brighton plantation became aware that Mr. Lincoln's army had captured New Orleans and might march north. An insurrection was planned. There are meticulous documents of the slave owners of Adams County, Mississippi, in which they investigated and executed slaves for talking about insurrection. A slave cost about 1 year's wages for a white laborer. Executing slaves was a very drastic matter for someone whose livelihood depended on what he perceived as his property. And you can see how seriously the slave owner took any conversation about insurrection if it would result in the execution of slaves. We know some good deal about the man who sent this bill, Volney Metcalf. He's a graduate of Yale. We have letters that his brother wrote to him at Yale giving advice about college life and asking if he needed him to send money. Some things never change. He went to medical school at the University of Pennsylvania. Penn was a favorite medical school for American Southerners. He took additional training in medicine in Paris. And when he came back, he went into private practice, practicing at the Montrose Plantation in Mississippi for 12 years. And then he opened up an office in Natchez. He died of yellow fever in 1852. I am told that his tomb still stands within the site of the ruins of the Montrose Plantation. We know some things about the Metcalf family because they married the family of St. John Richardson Little, an officer in the Confederate Army, and the wedding took place at the plantation. And we know that Volney Metcalf's brother was also a physician, Dr. James Metcalf. He owned 4 plantations. The Metcalfs were Kentuckians, and you can see that in the name of the 3rd plantation, Bourbon. They had 4 plantations. They had joined each other in Adams County. They had 315 slaves at 65 slave houses. But at the end of the war, they still held on to 6,500 acres. And James Metcalf had a son, Henry. Must be the Henry in my letter. Here is the evaluation of Volney Metcalf from his clinical rotation in Paris by a fellow student. I found him regular in his attendance at the hospitals and a close observer of the various diseases he met with therein. He cared but little for the gay company and the frivolities of Paris, which were constantly passing before him, without turning from the even tenor of his way. Quiet, cool, and cheerful, observant and temperate in all things, he made the best possible use of his time as a student and set an example worthy of imitation. When he pretended to study, he studied deeply and thoroughly, and I am indebted to him for much useful information on many points connected with practical medicine. Among others, I may mention that of the wounds of the head and concussions of the brain, he told me the best time to make observations on these diseases was by candlelight on Sunday mornings. The poor laborers of Paris, when they returned home on Saturday night with their week's wages, were often knocked down and robbed, notwithstanding the numerous guards of the city. They would be removed to the hospitals by early Sunday morning and during the night, and their wounds were fresh and often bleeding and requiring immediate surgical attention. It was only the early risers among the medical students who would get the opportunity of seeing the wounds dressed and witness the practice of the French physicians in concussions of the brain. He was a man ever ready, when abroad, not to be ashamed of his country, but on the proper occasion to vindicate its customs and institutions from the sneers of the ignorant and the conceited. How's that for an evaluation of the surgical rotation? Volney Metcalf's medical practice, of course, was driven by epidemic infectious disease. Yellow fever malaria, relapsing and remitting fevers of unknown origin. We can understand some of the health conditions in Mississippi from a letter that Volney got when he was at Yale. News from here in Mississippi is not favorable. As to the health of your brother's family, all appear well. The neighborhood's been sick generally. Your brother has 5 sick out of the family, 4 Negroes that he purchased last spring, 1 Negro woman and her 2 children, a girl 13, another boy 8 or 9, the other about 3 years old, and poor little Millie, who you're acquainted with. Yellow fever is back in Natchez. I hope it will be convenient for your brother to supply you with what you may need. And then he goes on to ask how much money he needs to get through the semester. My letter looks like it was delivered by Henry Metcalf. I can trace Henry as being born in 1829. He would have been 12 at the time the letter was delivered. He was the son of James Metcalf, the owner of the large plantations. And in 1852, Henry took over the plantation. It's called the Grove. When James Metcalf died in 1867, Henry administered 3 of the plantations, Bourbon, Montrose, and Grove. There's a bill in here for $15 for Fitzhenry Babbitt. Well, we know that John Mosby's wife's name for her first marriage was Babbitt. This must have been a stepchild. He would have been 11. He was Francis's child. He was born in Natchez. He followed his he followed Volney Metcalf to go to medical school at Penn. He's listed as a member of the medical school class of 1853. We know he was a surgeon in the Confederate Army with the Louisiana Regiment. We know he was in the Army from 1861 to 1864. We know after that he went into practice across the river in Louisiana. His grave is in Philadelphia, where I found it listed under the care of the Daughters of the American Confederacy still. Well, what does this letter tell us about the role of doctors in the medical care of enslaved African Americans? The story begins with the problem of the ship's doctor. By British law, and often by custom, slave ships had a ship's surgeon on board, a ship's doctor. If it was a small ship, the ship's captain could not afford a doctor and would take a book of medical instructions along with a box full of various potions to administer. For disease A, give bottle B. For disease C, give a mixture of bottles A and E. These ship's doctors were called the Guinea surgeons because slave trading was largely done on the Guinea coast, the west coast of Africa, now where you'd find Benin, the Ivory Coast, Guinea, going a little bit farther east to Nigeria, what is now called by some people Afrique, French Equatorial Africa. But if you think about it, it just doesn't make sense that a ship manned by white sailors would sail from Baltimore or Providence or Kingston, Jamaica, and lay anchor off the port of Africa, and that our men would go running into the bush and come back with slaves. They didn't know the territory. The ship could be spotted once the intentions were known, and that's not what happened. No one was seized directly by white slavers. These were Africans who were sold into slavery by fellow Africans. Archaeological digs have demonstrated the existence of large kingdoms, Dahomey and Alada. These kingdoms extended over large areas ruled by kings and clans. And when these kingdoms went to war with other tribes, those who were captured were often held to be sold as slaves to slave traders. You can find in excavations, recently an article in the American Scientist went through this, holes in the ground that appear to have been used to hide from slave traders. Forensic economists have studied how much income was generated by these tribes by trading in palm products, in orange, versus trading in humans, in blue. And you can see that until the Civil War, the overwhelming economy of these tribes was trading in humans. If you dig up in the areas of these tribal villages, you find all manner of things to indicate the presence of whites, because none of these are indigenous materials to Africa. There are no rusted flintlocks from muskets. There are no shells that came from North America, pottery, stems of pipes for smoking tobacco, colored beads. These are all evidence of an economic interaction between whites and Africans of the coast. There are remnants of forts. This is a Dahomean palace, which appears to have been one of the palaces which was defended by the Dahomean king's all-female armed forces against French attackers. A medical examination was considered a vital part of the slave trade because doctors were paid on commission. The mortality rate for the Middle Passage from Africa to the Americas was 5 to 50%. And if your cargo died, they couldn't be sold and you didn't make any money. So doctors were paid based on the survival probabilities. And we have evidence of them arguing with the captain over who got more of the rations or fresh air space on deck, because it was the doctor's best interest to provide it for the slaves. It was for the captain's best interest to do it for the crew or for himself. And they had competing economic interests. Slave ship surgeons performed their examinations either on the beach or the ship or in the slave forts. These surgeons were called, as I said, guinea surgeons. We have a medical textbook from 1729, The Sea Surgeon, written by a Dr. Thomas Aubrey. He cautions surgeons to preserve the slaves committed to their care because the more you preserve of them for a plantation, the more profit you will have, and the greater reputational wager so that you'll get a commission on another ship. Besides, it's a case of conscience to be as careful of them as the white man. For although they are heathens, yet they have a rational soul, and God knows whether it may not be more tolerable for them than for many who profess themselves Christians on Judgment Day. This is the one illustration I can find of a doctor performing an examination on the coast of Africa. This is a print from the mid-part of the 19th century related to a criminal trial that took place in England. Captain Kimber was accused of forcing a slave woman to dance naked on the deck for his entertainment, and she died. He went to trial. He was found not guilty. Many of the doctors thought that music and dance was healthy during the trip, so they forced the slaves to sing and dance on the deck of the ship once a day as part of their medical prescription. This drawing from Harper's Weekly shows a ship entering the harbor of Key West with the male and female cargo segregated. It was very common on slave ships to have fences built, like the one you see in the back. The ship's carpenter would build these on the trip going west to east, so that in the event of an insurrection on shipboard, the crew would retreat behind the fence and open fire on the slaves from a place of protection. Doctors did what were called soundness examinations. Are these people sound? Soundness meant I am judging them medically to be capable of working and to be subordinate to authority. Now, this concept of soundness still exists today, except it's used in veterinary medicine. Is this cow or sheep sound? It is the same terminology. Doctors would give a warranty on the merchandise, and you would pay them to do so. There are malpractice cases recorded in the United States. I am suing the doctor because he warranted that slave is healthy and she died 4 days after I bought them. You could pay a doctor to go to the slave market here on the docks in Louisville and assess the merchandise to be sold, and then the doctor would advise you, don't bid on the one on the left, but bid on the fourth one from the left, because that's good merchandise, on the order of about $1 per examination. Now, a constant puzzlement for Americans now is, why doesn't the rest of the world love us? Why do people try to blow us up in various places in the world? This illustration is to show you that this is an old concept in American history, not a new one. This is an abolitionist newspaper showing the United States slave trade, showing the master with a whip on horseback, the slaves chained, and you see the sarcasm. There's the Capitol building in the upper right-hand corner with the stars and stripes waving overhead. A British travel writer writes a travel book about coming to America in the 1840s, and she says, they talk about liberty. They hold the Declaration of Independence sacred. They wave the cap of liberty in their left hand while they whip their slaves with their right hand. They're hypocrites. This puzzlement at the Americans is a long-standing part of our history. This is a slave market, the merchandise at the foot of the auctioneer. This is a broadside advertisement announcing who would be sold and what other merchandise would be sold. You can see the prices, auction price $1,275, $1,300, $1,200. The ones that I have circled are to show that you were going to pay more for someone who was identified as a nurse, a slave who could also work as a nurse. That was more valuable property. I don't have any contemporary photographs of the kind of work that these slaves were doing in Adams County, Mississippi, but I found these by the famous artist and photographer Ben Shahn. This image was taken in 1935 on the docks of Natchez, Mississippi. Look at the size of the cotton bale that he's resting his hand on. These were carried by human power, and I'm betting that it probably wasn't much different in 1850, that these cotton bales were carried on the backs of slaves. Slave owners thought that they were engaged in enlightened paternalism. This cartoon shows in the upper image what happens to a poor free white man if he gets sick. He's put on a stretcher and carried off to the poorhouse. But if the slave gets sick, you can see the slave in the lower image in the master's bed, ministered to tenderly by the master as the mistress of the household brings a tray. How did doctors get paid for taking care of slaves? The common ways were called the fee-for-service bill, just like we do now, a fee-for-illness bill. You got pneumonia, here's my price for pneumonia. You got a gallstone, here's my price for a gallstone. Or what's called a fee bill. A fee bill was an HMO. You will pay me a flat rate for the care of all the slaves and the people who live on the plantation per year. These practices were a way for the plantation owner to understand in advance what medical care was going to cost. It was a fixed rate for the year, and it was a way for the doctor to pocket a large sum of money. But you have to wonder whether the slave's best interests were served by a system that was in the doctor's best interest to spend as little money as possible. Now, what was going to protect the slave's health care? It might be the doctor's conscience. It might be the oversight of the overseer, complaints by the slaves, the general reputation of the doctor. You could also pay people, as I said, by a fee per visit, or the third was to pay by the illness. Some doctors actually got paid as a function of outcome. Patient gets better, I get A. Patient doesn't get better, I get A minus B. You should not be surprised that HMOs were denounced by the AMA as creeping socialism by 1845, 1850. This is a letter to the editor of a Southern medical journal. The plan of attending families by the year is dictated by a trading, mercenary spirit unworthy of members of a dignified profession. It has too much the order of pelf about it and should at once be abandoned. I had to look it up. Pelf, it means mercenary, only caring about money. It may suit the dealer in matches, the butcher or the iceman, but it's out of place among physicians. We are glad to hear that notwithstanding the efforts of some members to have it recognized by the medical society, that respectable body condemned it. Low tradesmen in the profession that are beyond the pale of respectability or conceal their names from the public would engage in such behavior. Now, if you were dependent for a large part of your income on taking care of slaves, it was in your best interest to get along with the crowd and insinuate yourself into slave society. Some of the physicians became slave owners themselves. We know that a substantial part of a Southern doctor's income came from treating slaves. I give you one example. A doctor in South Carolina, 2/3 of his income was from the care of slaves. How can I prove it to you? Look at the number of doctors per capita in the United States. There were far more doctors per capita in slave-holding areas than non-slave-holding areas. Doctors went where the money was, and the money was in the care of slaves. Some of you may have read the famous book Time on the Cross, in which two economic historians analyze, were slaves treated like capital property? How much money would you invest in repairing a machine in your factory? Many slave owners, they argue, made a similar calculation for their human property. I'm going to put enough medical care in them to keep them productive. It was an economic issue, and doctors fed off of that. Now, the bill I showed you shows that Volney Metcalf charged $77 for a year's worth of services on the Brighton plantation. You can look that up on the various websites to convert dollars into present dollars. So if you convert that from $1841 to the present, that's a $2,000 medical bill, paid in full. What kind of medical care does that mean? Well, you can look up what are called at that time tariff fees. This is when the medical society would publish what was the standard rate. Now, they couldn't make you do it, but if you charged too much or too little, then there was a lot of peer pressure. And so there are lots of these tariff fees. Office visit, $1. Stay up with the patient all night, $10 to $20. Childbirth, $20. Vaccination of a slave, $2. They charge less for vaccinating a slave than a white person. Tonsillectomy, $10 to $50. Horseback ride for a house call or in your buggy, $2.50. So $77 is a lot of medical care. Can I show you any direct evidence about the story? Yes, I actually can. During the Roosevelt administration, in the midst of the Depression, there were all sorts of programs to make work for people. My father, should rest in peace, always said best thing Roosevelt ever did was the Civilian Conservation Corps. They took care of the national parks, they put up trails, they put in benches, they did a great thing. They made you send money home to mom and dad to support the family. Now, all over towns like Louisville, there are the famous WPA buildings, Work Progress Administration, post offices and libraries. They all have the characteristics, 1930s architecture. These were government programs designed to put people to work. And among them was called the Federal Writers Project. What are you going to do with an unemployed writer who wants to write the great American novel? Well, the taxpayers would pay for these people to write the famous travel guides. They wrote one for all the states. I've got one on my shelf from Kentucky. They went all over and told you what to go look at as a tourist. And some of these writers were employed in what was called the slave narrative collection. They went around with recording devices or shorthand and interviewed former slaves. There are over 2,300 of these interviews. Now, these are interviews in the midst of the Great Depression, so we are interviewing 80 and 90-year-olds about things that happened when they were 10 or 15 years of age. And you could either say, lousy evidence, Edward, it's too far, I don't remember what I had for lunch last Tuesday, much less what would have happened that many years ago. Or you could say, as scarifying as an experience as slavery, people probably did remember. I will show you some of these. You will forgive some of the next slides. These are direct quotes. Some of the people wrote in their imitation of dialect. The slaves were well treated when we got sick. My master had a standing doctor that he paid by the year. There was a hospital building near the quarters and a good old granny woman to nurse the sick. There were 5 or 6 beds in a room. One room was for the men, one room for the women. The doctor was named Richardson. He tended us long after the war. He was a gentleman, a powerful, good doctor. However, many of these narratives very clearly state that we were property and the amount of medical care we got was a function of how valuable we were viewed to be. Quote, when a slave got sick, the master would get a good doctor for him if he was a good slave, but if he wasn't considered a good slave, he would be given cheap medical care. When Dr. Cannon found out that his carriage driver had learned to read and write, he was taking the doctor's children to and from school. He had that man's thumbs cut off and put another boy to doing the driving in his place. It was illegal to teach a slave to read and write. There are more of these narratives, but some of them start using language which would probably be offensive to modern ears, but you get the gist of this. Well, I've been telling you about white medical care of enslaved African Americans. This was generally the last resort. The first line of medical care was African Americans taking care of African Americans. They brought with them a list of folk remedies from Africa or what they ascertained from herbs and berries in and around the plantation. They often cared for each other. Sometimes they would not admit illness because they thought that white doctors were crazy. They're going to make me vomit, they're going to give me diarrhea, and they're going to make me bleed. What kind of people are these? Don't tell them you're sick, they'll make you worse. Also, many slave owners had a manual that they kept on the property, and they were the first line of medical care, them or the overseer, dishing out various remedies and potions. Sometimes they didn't want to pay the doctor to make a house visit, so they'd write a letter and say, what am I supposed to do? They'd wait for the doctor to write back and then do what they said, and then as a last resort, you'd actually call for the doctor to come out to the plantation. This is one such book, a manual called The Planter's and Mariner's Medical Companion, and it tells you what to do. You could buy these books often along with a wooden box that had all the various medications in it with instructions of how to administer them. I wonder, what did the doctors think they were doing? One popular Southern medical writer was Samuel Cartwright, and he was wondering why it was that these Africans didn't get malaria and yellow fever the way white people did. Were they a different species? Was it different biology? What was it about them? Like some people of his times, he concluded that Africans were not humans, that based on their facial features and body, they were something closer to those unusual apes that the mariners had described seeing when they went to Africa, and that were sometimes exhibited as popular amusements. They wondered why the slaves often got sick. It's interesting that many of them do not make any comments about what happens if people are exposed to the elements with no shoes or clothes sufficient for the weather. People were housed close together in unventilated space without sanitation for human waste. What can we conclude about my little piece of paper? I have tried to persuade you that this is a medical bill for the care of free whites and African American slaves in southwest Mississippi. I have told you that this is from a well-trained and esteemed white physician named Dr. Volney Metcalf of Montrose Plantation near Natchez, and the bill went to Mr. Mosby. I have said that this bill shows two white children described, Fitzhenry Babbitt, who becomes a Confederate medical officer, and Henry Metcalf, who inherits Dad's plantation. And that this piece of paper might teach us about medical billing practices of the time and the medical care of slaves. That's all interesting. Why did he want to talk about this? Or some of you were thinking, he said he spent the 5 years working on this. No wonder the merger didn't get approved. Why do we care about my piece of paper? I want to offer you a reason why you should care about this $40 piece of paper that's 170 years old. Physicians love to think that we are engaged in above-the-fray, intrinsically wonderful, laudable activity. We are all wonderful. We are doctors, are we not? We are all doing God's work. And what we do is objectively wonderful. Anyone would know that. I think that it's not so. That medicine is a fundamentally social activity that takes place in the context of its times. And that doctors are always responding to what is the prevailing wisdom of the time and are generally followers, not leaders. When it is the standard practice to racially segregate medical schools, the University of Louisville racially segregates its medical school. When it is standard practice to be biased against Roman Catholics or Jews or women in admission to medical schools do it too. When it is standard practice to torture people, we observe torture. That's what doctors always seem to do, and we almost never lead. We almost always follow. What does this have to do with the bill? If you are my age or older, you will remember black and white television, and I remember an extraordinary story that captivated the news from 1960 to 1963. In Argentina, this is the Argentine flag, a man gets off a city bus. He's a factory worker, and he's walking down the street to go home. He stops to buy flowers. But it's not his wedding anniversary, according to Argentine records. But it is the wedding anniversary of someone far more notorious. And those people who watch him buy the flowers send a telegram through diplomatic pouches back home saying, the man is the man they're watching. 2 weeks after this man is bundled into a car by a bunch of people in suits and disappears, a stunned parliament in Israel listens to the Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, announce Adolf Eichmann, the notorious Nazi war criminal, is in Israel under Israeli custody and will stand trial for his crimes. He has been kidnapped from Buenos Aires, dressed up in an El Al airplane uniform, drugged and brought from Buenos Aires to Jerusalem. And if you're my age or older, you remember that community center in Tel Aviv where a man in a bulletproof glass booth and witnesses describe the Nazi Holocaust. From this episode comes the description of the term the banality of evil. The New Yorker magazine sends a reporter to cover the Eichmann trial. She is a famed intellectual historian, Hannah Arendt, whose most famous book is called On Totalitarianism. She leaves Europe before the World War and lives in America, teaching at several universities, and is quite famous. And the New Yorker, therefore, has a famous reporter sent off to cover the trial. She writes a very controversial book, which is still being debated, although it came out in 1963 and 1964. Deborah Lipstadt has just published a very interesting book attacking Arendt and going through the documentation to show that actually she was wining and dining in Europe during much of the trial and wasn't actually there. Her book is called Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. When I was working on this little letter, I went on one of those used book sites and bought my paperback copy and read it. It's a fascinating reporting and as well as philosophical treatise. And in the book, Arendt makes her arresting conclusion that has made this book such controversy. She says there are almost no pictures of Eichmann from the 1930s and 40s. He meticulously didn't allow himself to be photographed. He destroyed them. We have one blurry photograph of him in a uniform. What we see on trial before our eyes and on black and white television is a balding, dumb accountant. He's not even an accountant. He never made it to college. He's a bookkeeper. His German is lousy. His own lawyer says he's of the low-class, uneducated type. He gives rambling answers. He's supposed to look like Satan, but he doesn't. He looks like a third-class bureaucrat. We were putting him on trial to see the embodiment of evil, and he doesn't look the part. No one has accused him of shooting anybody. No one has accused him of, with his own hands, gassing anybody. He arranged the train schedules to load people up and take them to the concentration camps. He bought the railway cars. He kept meticulous records to be sure that everyone was rounded up. He made sure the police did what they were supposed to. He made sure that the poison gas was ordered for the concentration camps. He made sure that the crematoria worked. He orchestrated this as a bureaucrat. He facilitated the process. There is one suggestion that he may have been involved in killing a person himself, but we can hardly demonstrate that. He made sure the trains ran on time. He was a facilitator. Evil may be articulated and initiated by sociopaths, but it is generally implemented by average people who treat evil as routine and normative. This Arendt calls the banality of evil. Happens all the time, doesn't it? If you listen to the transcripts of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, you can buy it where all the speeches are on it. I've done it. Before Martin Luther King speaks, there's a very brief speech by a man with a German accent, Johannem Prinz, a former chief rabbi of Germany who survives the concentration camps and comes to America. And he says, I have learned in my long life the greatest evil is not evil, it is silence in the face of evil. The same thing that Arendt is saying. What did the architect think he was doing, the ship's architect, who meticulously drew these blueprints to show how many humans could be put on the ship? He collected his fee. Did he lie awake at night saying, what have I done? They're all on the archives of the Library of Congress and in the Admiralty in England. What were they thinking? Did they just collect their fee? What did the doctor think? Did they think these people weren't people? Did they say they were facilitating the slave trade? Did they lie awake at night? Or did they say this is normative? Weren't they part of this banality of evil of keeping the slave trade going? Okay, Edward, okay, I get your point, and that was before the end of the Civil War. It has nothing to do with us. Yes, it does. Whenever doctors do things in which they are subordinate to a third party outside the doctor-patient relationship, then if that third party is asking to do things that are wrong, then they are facilitating the evil. If you don't take care of your patients because the insurance system doesn't let you do so properly, or the reimbursement system, and you don't do something about it, then you are getting along and going along so you can collect your fee. Well, for those of you who got a free lunch, then let's take some even more controversial ideas head on. No group of doctors are going to get mad at me for bashing the insurance industry, so let's bash some things that might make you uncomfortable. Is it okay that we pay for our amusement largely underrepresented minority men and now women to bash each other's heads with their fists, and we enjoy that and call it a sport, and we say it's okay, there's a doctor at ringside? Is that okay to have a doctor at ringside? Should the medical board say that's an okay practice of medicine? Is there some reason why we should encourage people financially to bash their fists into their heads for entertainment? And that doctors should facilitate that? Well, I don't like boxing anyway. Okay, we will celebrate a national television orgy on Sunday afternoon where nothing will happen while a group of grown men paid enormous amounts of money will play a children's game. They will do manly things, and you can't change the rules because that would take away from the game. And it's okay, Edward, because there's a doctor on the sidelines. They've all had physicals. When I was a young doctor in Boston, they would tell us, you can't make those hockey players wear helmets or mouth guards. It'll ruin the game. But I notice now they actually wear helmets and mouth guards, and they're still making money in professional ice hockey. Well, this looks okay. This next picture is from the Louisville Courier-Journal. I cut it out. You can see my scissor marks. So we want humans to use their heads as battering rams while we drive them into the cervical spines of other humans to knock their helmet off and make them unconscious. We don't want to change those rules. That would ruin the game of a children's game. They're doing it for free. I mean, no one makes them do it, Edward. They can do it voluntarily. Right. There's all sorts of things that governments tell us we can't do. I'd like to maybe drive on the left side of the road on Floyd Street with my bicycle. I can't. We ride on the right side in this country. We have stoplights. We have all sorts of people who call themselves on one side of the political spectrum, but want to tell people what they can do in the privacy of their own homes with their reproductive rights. We tell people all the time they can't do things. So saying you have free choice to do this, I don't think is actually much of an argument. There are lots of things we tell people they can't do. Okay, friends, it will soon be August, and you know what is going to happen. Some children will die of heat stroke preparing or playing football games. Some children will be rendered quadriplegic or paraplegic from spinal cord injury, and we don't know how many million of them will be sent down a pathway of sports-related concussion injuries. It is the tip of the iceberg. Looking at one of my medical journals, Sports Illustrated, last month, I came across this article. To tell you the truth, I don't read it, but I bought it in the airport because I wanted to read the article about Mike Krzyzewski on the cover. Okay, what the author did is he decided, let's see what happened to the Cincinnati Bengals football team 25 years after this picture was taken. 2 of the 48 players are dead, 1 from a motor vehicle accident, 1 suicide, 1's in prison, 6 that I won't talk to you, 39 responded to the survey. 72% had surgery during their career for a football injury, 41% surgery afterwards, 31% are scheduled for surgery at the time of the interview, 92% have a chronic football-related ailment. They say on average that I have 3 parts of my body that hurt every day from playing football. Half of them have memory loss, a third of them have a daily headache, almost all of them suffered a concussion. They've had a variety of joints replaced or needing to be replaced. And we feel okay about it because it's under medical supervision. Well, you could all make your own list of things that I would assert in modern times are part of doctors involved in the banality of evil. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. As the New Yorker cartoon says, I'm happy to open the floor to shorter speeches, which may or may not be disguised as questions. Yes.
I actually have a question about the history part, which is about gender and about the female slaves were valued not just for the working ability, but for the reproductive ability. Is that something that gets addressed?
The question, for those who didn't hear it, was the issue of gender in slavery and whether a differential value of female slaves of childbearing age or not, and what do we know about it. I'm going to offer you what I know about it, not from sensationalist novels or abolitionist pamphlets, but from data. One of the little-known facts of American history is that when the Congress in 1808 forbade importation of slaves, the law required slave ship owners to maintain meticulous logs of their cargo for interstate transport. That meant that the slaves had to be identified by gender, height, and weight, and age. So if you took slaves from the port of Baltimore to Charleston, that's all recorded. And economic historians have gone through the records of female slaves to try to ascertain whether there was intentional breeding going on of the slaves based on their weight in the menstrual cycle by age. And we also know some things about this from forensic pathology, looking at the mineral contents of the bones of slaves, how much iodine was in the bones, were they fed fish or were they only being fed molasses and meal. The objective evidence actually shows very little evidence of breeding of female slaves under direction. It does not. It's just not there. We have, however, poignant stories of the number of children fathered by white men with African American women. My youngest daughter was an American Studies major in college and wrote one of her term papers on slave narratives of the 1880s and 1890s. And the most painful part to read were the diaries of what I remember as a child. I remember people recalling, I played with the white children until I was 4, but I remember when I was 4 or 5, they started telling me that I wasn't allowed to play with them anymore because I wasn't the same, that wasn't my playmate, that was master. And I didn't understand what that meant. And then the even more painful was, I didn't understand why my playmate and I had the same father, but I was told I was a slave, but my playmate wasn't, even though we both had the same daddy. And a child trying to process this information. Objective evidence, no. Textual evidence, yes. I know that I haven't said things that were all straightforward. I'm happy to talk about anything you want. Yes, sir.
I came in human and slave, and I don't know if you addressed the issue of the role of enslaved Africans in medical education and how significant that role was. It does not appear in the medical textbook, but there would not be medical education in the United States without the experimentation done on enslaved Africans.
The question was the role of African Americans in medical education. A couple of things. Some white doctors tried to figure out why these Africans didn't get malaria and yellow fever. And for some of them, it became an exercise in oral history. There are some books of whites interviewing slaves saying, what do you give each other? What is that stuff? Show me which plant you're grinding up. Trying to understand what the African pharmacopoeia was, because they thought that was the key to understanding the treatment of malaria, yellow fever, typhus, typhoid. Second, we have lots of advertisements that were run in southern newspapers in the 1830s, 1840s. Come to medical school at the Medical College of South Carolina. We have lots of bodies for you to dissect because we provide free medical care to slaves who are almost about to die, and then you get to dissect them. So you'll get a great anatomy experience coming here. We have evidence of bodies showing up in northern cities from slaves being packed in turpentine in liquor barrels and being shipped to the north for dissection. We have the long story, for example, of vaginal fistula repair. And was the vaginal fistula repairs on Africans in which no whites would serve as a surgical assistant to Sims, were these volunteers or not? And he was lauded as a hero by some medical societies, and some white medical societies expelled him as a barbarian for operating with no or little anesthesia. We have evidence, for example, in Augusta, Georgia, that the Medical College of Georgia faculty bought a slave whose job it was to be the medical school's grave robber, and that he disproportionately robbed from African American cemeteries. And after the Civil War, after emancipation, he was hired as the janitor, and he worked until about 1910, robbing from black cemeteries. So here in Louisville, there are reports in the New York Times in the 1870s of University of Louisville medical students being caught climbing in through a window in the morgue to steal bodies for anatomy class, and a dramatic episode in which they row across the Ohio River to steal bodies in Indiana, and the citizens of Indiana open up with muskets on the medical students as they try to row back, and no one is killed. Basically, the answer to your question is that in any society in which there are poor and marginalized people, they tend to be the fodder of medical education. Whether African Americans, poor people, seamen. And some historians would say that it only changed when people in positions of power began to decide that medicine actually did some good. And so I'm willing to donate my body because medicine actually makes a difference. Or I've been reading the papers in World War I and it looks like medical care might matter for my son, so we better worry more about medical education, and maybe white people should get involved in this. Yeah. And I would say finally, sir, if for those of you who are thinking, okay, well that's, in the past, if someone decides that there are some hospitals in Louisville that's job it is to take care of the poor and the black and the marginalized, and that it's okay if they have to be kept waiting for a couple of weeks, and it's okay if the carpet is frayed, and it's okay if the phones don't get answered, and it's okay if the doctor's late. But there are other hospitals in Louisville where upper-class white people get taken care of by doctors who answer the phone in the first ring and smile a lot, and there's shag carpeting and wood wainscoting on the wall. Was there a plebiscite that I missed here in Louisville where people voted and said they wanted to have segregated medical care? I don't think so. But there is a very strong theme that it's okay for medical students and interns and residents to learn on poor people. But when you're done, then you'll be able to take care of private patients. So I don't think actually it's all much changed. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question regarding what I think is a kind of imperfect analogy between Eichmann and physicians who cared for slaves, just in that kind of absent providing care to slaves, or all physicians had thrown their hands up and said, I won't work within the system because it's inherently wrong. Arguably, slaves would have not received any medical care. And I think just thinking about our current situation, how would you advise rising medical professionals to work within a system that has flaws and is broken without falling victim to facilitating it and making it move forward?
People don't like public disapproval, particularly by people who have high social standing. If in states in the United States in which boxing is legal, if the county medical society started debating resolutions about whether someone would be dismissed from the medical society for participating in such activity. In some states in the United States where medical societies say administering lethal doses of drugs for executions is not part of the practice of medicine. Often we do things like this, not because we actually think we're going to win the vote, but we're going to make enough noise that people are found that they're embarrassed by what they're doing and they start to change. So, if we said as a profession, it's just wrong to have people bash their heads together like that. Now, you want to play football? I'm no expert on football, doctor says, but I read this thing in the Time magazine which says if they move where they kick the ball off 10 yards downfield, then people wouldn't be able to get up to roughly the equivalent of 40 miles an hour when they whack into each other. That seems like a common sense thing. Maybe they shouldn't be allowed at the line of scrimmage to start down on three-point stance, but it should go back the way it used to be. You had to be standing up. So it would be more pushing and shoving rather than using your head as a battering ram. And until you make changes like that, maybe I won't be available for the game. Yeah, it's just not right. Lots of stuff can change. You know, people of my age remember there were some people who marched and demonstrated in the civil rights movement, and there are some people who would say things like, I just don't feel comfortable coming to visit to give a lecture at your state university based on what's going on, the way your government, and I think I'll just take a pass. And people say, geez, you know, I can't even get a visiting professor to come to Jackson, Mississippi because the people up in the north are embarrassed. But, you know, we got to do something about that. And if you don't want to believe what I said, I recommend reading Bill Chafe's book about why did desegregation occur in North Carolina with very few demonstrations. And his argument is the business community said it's bad for business, we're looking like fools nationally, we got to cut it out because we're being embarrassed. That works too. How would I advise a medical student? When stuff happens that you think is wrong, there are polite ways to talk about it. To take a faculty member aside and say, I know we always go to that room every Friday for lunch and the drug company reps bring free pizzas and hand out their brochures, but you know, Professor, there's this vote by the American Society of Medical Students saying that they condemn this kind of stuff, and if you don't mind, I'll bring my own lunch. That sends a message too. Bring your own lunch. Dr. Lindman.
You know, you said in the end about the medical students working on the poor and treating the rich later. Well, that's one of the reasons why the HOC should have open access to residents and students in the clinics in all departments all the time, rather than an exclusive policy that we have now, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. I will conclude with one story. I'm sorry, Dr. Tobin.
Is there any study going on in the University Medical Center, or is there any state regulatory agent that is looking at the maldistribution of hospitals geographically? The absence in Louisville's West End, the progressive closings in the Southwest, and the sudden proliferation of hospitals along the Gene Snyder and the wealthier areas of our country?
Only angry politicians that represent the districts that don't have the hospitals. So you can bet every time someone tries to move a CON or build a new building, whoever's the loser in the game, their member of the State House or Senate will make a roaring stink about it, as happened in South Louisville with the Jewish hospital affiliate. But there is no state agency. The only thing I can remotely think about this is there was a very detailed report in New York State a couple of years ago about this, and arguing that some hospitals just needed to be closed to deal with this. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming.